When you read a title like The Secret Every Mechanic Uses But Won't Tell You, you probably expect some magic product or a sneaky hack. The truth is way more powerful than that. The real secret is a system, a way of thinking, that good mechanics use every single day to diagnose cars fast, protect their time, and protect their money. And once you understand it, you will never look at a repair shop, a used car lot, or even your own driveway the same way again. Before we dive in, set yourself up however you like. Maybe you are driving to work, wrenching on your own car, sitting at your job, or just relaxing on the couch. This episode is made so you can let it play in the background while you live your life and still soak up the insight. Let me start with a quick story from my mobile mechanic days. I got a call from a customer who said the car was possessed. The dash lit up like a Christmas tree, the transmission was shifting hard, and 3 different shops had already thrown parts at it. Coils, sensors, even a used transmission computer. Thousands of dollars gone, problem still there. When I showed up, I did what every good mechanic does first. I did nothing. I listened. That is the first part of the secret. Real mechanics are detectives, not parts installers. We gather a story. I asked the customer when it started, what changed recently, who worked on the car before. While we talked, I watched little details. Low-quality battery terminals, a cheap alarm system half hanging under the dash, a slightly burnt plastic smell inside the cabin. Next step in the secret system is verification. The customer says it shifts hard, so I have to feel it myself. I took the car around the block, feeling every gear change, watching the instrument cluster, paying attention to when each warning light came on. Behind the scenes, I am doing advanced automotive diagnostics in my head, building a mental timeline of events instead of jumping straight to a guess. Once I verified the complaint, I grabbed my scan tool. Not a cheap little reader, but a real diagnostic scanner that pulls live data from the engine, transmission, and body modules. A big part of the secret is that pros use data, not hope. I pulled codes, looked at freeze frame data, checked voltage at the battery and alternator. Within a few minutes, the scanner showed low system voltage at the exact moment the transmission slammed into gear. Now the pattern recognition kicks in. Every mechanic with enough experience has a personal library in their head. Dead batteries that killed fuel pumps. Loose grounds that made dashboards look haunted. Bad alternators that cooked transmission control modules. In this case, the combination of low voltage, cheap terminals, and a bunch of random electrical problems screamed power supply issue, not a bad transmission. So instead of selling a transmission or another computer, I cleaned the grounds, replaced the battery terminals with quality ones, tested the alternator under load, and cleared the codes. We drove again. Smooth shifts, no lights. The customer asked me what magic I used. I told them the real secret was simple, a process. Verify, measure, compare to patterns, then act. Here is another quick one from the dealership side. A compact sedan kept coming back with a check engine light. 3 different advisors wrote it up as misfire on cylinder 4. 2 techs had already installed new spark plugs and a coil. Still misfiring. The car was starting to get labeled as a problem child. The service manager was annoyed, the customer was frustrated, and everyone was leaning toward blaming the car brand. I pulled it in and did what the flat-rate world rarely rewards. I slowed down. I verified the misfire at idle and under load, then pulled live misfire counts on the scanner. Cylinder 4 was the worst, but 1 and 2 were slightly unstable too. Instead of throwing more ignition parts, I smoked the intake system, checked fuel trims, and ran a compression test. Turned out there was a tiny vacuum leak at a cracked hose under the intake, plus 1 injector that was getting weak. Fixed the leak, cleaned the injector, relearned the idle, and the misfire was gone for good. That is the secret again. Slow down, follow a structure, and let data guide you instead of fear. Another huge piece of the secret every mechanic uses, but rarely explains, is that we almost never look at just the symptom right in front of us. We are always thinking in systems. Engine, transmission, charging, cooling, suspension, electronics. They all connect. When you only stare at one noise or one warning light, you miss the bigger picture. When you think like a mechanic, you train your brain to see the whole car. Let me give you an example from a pre-purchase inspection I did for a customer who found a used luxury SUV online. On the advertisement, it looked perfect. Clean photos, shiny paint, low miles, and the famous line, "Runs great." The seller met us in a grocery store parking lot and kept talking about how fast other buyers were calling. It smelled like pressure. While my customer chatted, I stayed quiet and went into inspection mode. I walked around the truck slowly, looking at panel gaps, overspray on the edges of the doors, different shades of paint under the same light. The front bumper looked just a little too fresh compared to the hood. Inside, the steering wheel was much more worn than the mileage suggested. All those are classic ownership cost analysis clues. Someone drove this thing a lot more than the odometer claimed, or the cluster had been replaced. Out came the scan tool again. No check engine light on the dash, but half the monitors were not ready. That is another secret. Good mechanics do not just look for codes. We look at what is missing. When monitors are not ready, it often means somebody recently cleared the memory to hide a history of problems. In the live data, I found misfire counts slowly ticking up on 2 cylinders and slightly rich fuel trims. The transmission module showed a stored overheat code from a few hundred miles ago. Then, I slid under the truck on the pavement, because as a mobile mechanic, you do what you have to do. The transmission pan had fresh silicone around it, and the cooler lines showed signs of recent removal. That told me there had already been some kind of powertrain repair. Maybe a fluid change done wrong, maybe a bigger problem. Combined with the data, it looked like a vehicle that had been overheated and patched up enough to drive. My customer asked me what I thought. Here is where the secret turns into money. Advanced automotive diagnostics is not just about fixing problems. It is about telling the truth early so people do not marry the wrong car. I laid it out clearly. The SUV might drive fine today, but the mix of hidden codes, partial resets, and past overheating made it a bad bet for long-term reliability. We walked away. A week later, the same truck showed up online again with slightly different pictures and a slightly lower price. Another story from the driveway. A customer booked me for brakes and a vibration at highway speeds. They had already gotten one quote from a chain shop that wanted to sell them 4 new tires, 4 new rotors, wheel bearings, and a full alignment. The total was more than half the value of the car. The customer said they felt like they were being punished for asking a question. I took the car for a drive and paid attention to when the vibration showed up. It was worst on light braking from higher speeds, which usually points toward warped rotors or uneven pad deposits, not tires. Back at the house, I lifted the car, checked suspension components, measured rotor thickness, and spun each wheel by hand, listening through a mechanic's stethoscope. 2 rotors were glazed and slightly out of spec. The tires were cheap, but still had life and no obvious defects. Instead of that massive quote, I recommended front rotors and pads with a proper bed-in, plus a balance on the 2 worst wheels. We did the work right there in the driveway. When we went for another test drive, the vibration was almost completely gone. We talked about a realistic maintenance strategy going forward, not just big scary invoices. That mix of technical automotive knowledge and honest communication is a huge part of the secret every good mechanic tries to live by, even if shops do not always reward it. And once you see how this works, you stop feeling powerless and start making smarter decisions with every vehicle you touch. There is another side to the secret every mechanic uses, and most drivers never see it because it lives in the numbers, not the tools. I am talking about time, flat rate hours, and the way shops actually survive. When you understand that side, a lot of strange experiences you have had at dealerships and independent shops suddenly make sense. At a big dealership I used to work at, we had a saying, "The car is the guest, the clock is the boss." Flat rate means you get paid by the job, not the hour. If the book says a water pump pays 3 hours and you finish it in 2, you made good money. If rust, broken bolts, or bad access turns it into a 5-hour nightmare, you still only get paid those 3. The secret that good techs use to stay alive in that system is efficiency mixed with honesty. Here is a real example. A mid-sized sedan came in with a coolant leak. Another tech glanced at it, saw dried coolant around the water pump, and wrote it up as a pump replacement. Fast ticket, good hours. The advisor sold it. Before the car got pushed to his bay, the schedule got shuffled, and it landed with me instead. I still remember the look on his face when he realized I had the job. Instead of jumping straight to the pump, I pressure tested the system and watched. Coolant started dripping from a tiny hairline crack in a plastic coolant neck above the pump. The pump had some staining, but it was not the main source. If I had just slammed in a pump, the leak would have come back. The customer would have lost trust, and the shop would have eaten the comeback. By slowing down for 10 extra minutes on the front end, I saved hours of pain later. That is the quiet secret a lot of experienced mechanics live by. You either pay attention up front with real diagnostics, or you pay much more later in comebacks, bad reviews, and lost reputation. The same idea shows up in mobile work. When I am out in a driveway, I do not have 10 different techs to hand a problem to. I do not have 10 lifts. What I do have is a brain trained to connect symptoms, data, and real-world patterns, so I can give a data-driven recommendation that actually holds up. Let me tell you about a repossession lot I used to visit. I was hired to inspect cars before they went to auction. Most of them had rough histories, missed payments, hard driving, bad maintenance. The lot manager only cared about whether they started and moved. My quiet job was to figure out which ones were ticking time bombs. I would walk rows of cars in the early morning, dew on the hoods, listening to cold engines, checking transmission engagement, scanning modules, and writing quick notes. One compact hatchback looked clean and shiny, with new tires and a detailed interior. It idled smooth and shifted okay on a short drive, but I noticed heavy varnish under the oil cap and very dark transmission fluid that smelled burnt. The scan tool showed multiple past misfire codes and a history of transmission over temp. On paper it ran and drove, but from a long-term performance and ownership cost point of view, it was a bad gamble. In the same row sat a boring sedan with faded paint and a stained seat. Most buyers would walk right past it. The oil was clean, the coolant was clear, the transmission fluid was dark but not burnt, and the scan showed almost no history of major faults. The idle was steady, fuel trims were normal, and the drive felt solid. That car, ugly as it was, went to auction and quietly became somebody's reliable daily. Those days taught me that the secret every mechanic uses is not about hiding things from customers. It is about seeing deeper than the surface. When you combine technical checks, pattern recognition, and a realistic sense of how people actually drive, you can separate shiny problems from ugly gems. And when you learn to think that way as a buyer, you protect yourself from a lot of expensive surprises. That is what I try to teach on F-Car Habits. Not how to turn wrenches, but how to think like a mechanic when you spend your hard-earned money. So what exactly is this secret every mechanic uses, but rarely says in one clear sentence? We treat every car like a puzzle made of symptoms, data, history, and driver behavior, and we follow the same process every time so we can make smart calls under pressure. The better that process, the more accurate the diagnosis, and the safer the driver. That mindset does not just apply to broken cars. It shapes how we think about maintenance and long-term vehicle reliability. There is a difference between random oil changes and a real strategy that protects your engine and your money. When you think like a mechanic, you stop asking if it is fine today and start asking what it will look like many miles from now. I had a customer who drove for a delivery app in an older sedan. They came to me after a dealership told them they needed almost everything: shocks, struts, mounts, control arms, transmission service, coolant flush, brake fluid, plugs, coils, the list went on. The estimate was so high it made no sense for the value of the car, and they were scared they would have to quit driving. We sat in their driveway with the hood up while the engine idled. I pulled live data, checked for codes, looked at fuel trims and temperatures, then we went for a drive on their actual route. Yes, the struts were tired but not dangerous yet. The transmission fluid was dark but did not smell burnt. The plugs were worn but not misfiring. Instead of replacing everything at once, we built a plan. First, we handled safety-critical items. Brakes, a couple of suspension bushings that were torn through, and a set of tires. Then we scheduled fluid services over the next few months as their delivery income came in. That is high-value automotive insight, using technical knowledge to match real-life budgets instead of scaring someone into debt. A year later, the car was still on the road, and they had upgraded on their own terms. Another story comes from a family SUV that had been through 3 owners in the same household. It showed up with hard starting and occasional stalling at lights. 2 shops had suggested a new fuel pump and an ignition switch, and the quotes were painful. When I scanned it and went through the data, nothing dramatic jumped out. No major codes, just a history of low-voltage events stored in memory. I asked one simple question. Who put in the last battery? A relative had installed it in a hurry about a year earlier. I pulled the battery, checked the connections, and found corrosion hiding between the terminal and the cable on the ground side. Clean that. Install a proper clamp. Load test the battery and charging system, and the starting issue disappeared. No pump, no ignition switch, just solid basics applied with discipline. Here is where this matters for you while you drive, work, clean the house, or wind down for the night. You can borrow this mindset without ever becoming a professional tech. When a shop hands you a big estimate, ask them to separate safety, comfort, and long-term prevention. Ask whether they verified the complaint and performed real diagnostics, or whether the parts list comes from habit and guesswork. You can also use this secret when you shop for a car. Bring someone who can scan for codes and read live data, or invest in a scanner and learn it slowly. Check service records, tire wear, paint consistency, and how the transmission shifts cold and hot. Think about engine performance evaluation, powertrain analysis, and vehicle safety considerations, not just gadgets and shiny trim. The secret every mechanic uses but rarely says out loud is simple. Process beats panic. Data beats guessing. Honest conversations beat clever sales pitches. When you start thinking like that, you stop being the person who only shows up at the shop when something explodes and start becoming the person who manages their machines with quiet confidence. So as you roll through your day with this episode from F-Car Habits in your ears, remember this. You do not need a lift, a wall of tools, or a fancy badge on your shirt to think like a mechanic. You need curiosity, patience, and a willingness to look a little deeper than the surface. With that and good information, you protect your wallet, your time, and the people you drive with.